Before Al Capone became a household name, before the Tommy guns rattled through Chicago's streets, before Prohibition turned America into the world's largest criminal playground, there was a quiet, calculating man who engineered it all from the shadows. His name was Johnny Torrio, and while history remembers the soldiers, it often forgets the general who drew up the battle plans. This is the story of the man who didn't just build an empire, he invented the blueprint that every gangster after him would follow. Picture this. February 1882. A small village called Irsina in the sun-baked mountains of southern Italy. The land is beautiful but unforgiving, and the people are even harder. Among the stone houses and olive groves, a boy is born who will one day reshape the American underworld. But young Giovanni Torrio, who would later become John, and eventually Johnny, to those closest to him, didn't come into this world with any advantages. His father died when he was just 2 years old, leaving his mother Maria to raise him alone in a world where being fatherless meant being vulnerable. Maria Torrio was a woman of iron will, wrapped in Mediterranean warmth. She looked at her young son and saw not just a child, but their only chance at survival. In 1884, when Johnny was barely 2 years old, she made the decision that millions of desperate Europeans were making. She would take her boy to America, that mythical land where the streets were supposedly paved with gold. She had no money, no connections, and spoke not a word of English. But she had something more valuable than any of those things she had: a determination that could move mountains. The journey across the Atlantic was hell. Packed into steerage with hundreds of other immigrants, the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness filled the air. Little Johnny clung to his mother as the ship rolled through storms that seemed sent by an angry god. People died on that crossing: the old, the weak, the unlucky. But Maria and Johnny survived. When they finally saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the harbor mist, Maria wept. She had gambled everything on a dream, and now they would see if America would keep its promise. They didn't land in paradise. They landed in Hell's Kitchen, one of the most violent neighborhoods in New York City. But Maria was pragmatic. She soon moved them to Brooklyn, to a neighborhood called Williamsburg that was rapidly filling with Italian immigrants. The streets weren't paved with gold. They were paved with horse manure, garbage, and the crushed dreams of people who'd arrived before them, expecting miracles. Young Johnny grew up in a cramped tenement apartment where you could hear your neighbors' arguments. Lovemaking and death rattles through walls thin as paper. The building always smelled like boiled cabbage, garlic, and desperation. In summer, the heat was suffocating. Families would sleep on fire escapes and rooftops, anywhere to catch a breath of air that didn't feel like it was being exhaled from the mouth of hell itself. In winter, they huddled around coal stoves that never quite managed to drive the cold from their bones. But here's where Johnny Torrio's story takes its first crucial turn, the turn that would define everything that came after. While other immigrant kids were running wild in the streets, joining gangs, and getting into fights that ended with knives in alleys, Johnny was different. He was watching, learning, calculating. Maria found work in a sweatshop, sewing garments for 16 hours a day, her fingers bleeding onto the fabric she stitched. She made sure Johnny went to school, and the boy proved to be unnaturally bright. He absorbed English like a sponge, reading everything he could get his hands on, while his mother worked herself to exhaustion. Johnny would sit in the apartment reading newspapers he found in the trash, teaching himself not just the language but how this new country actually worked. Teachers noticed him. This small, quiet Italian boy with the serious eyes and the careful manners. He wasn't like the other rough kids from the neighborhood. He did his homework. He paid attention. He never caused trouble. One teacher, Mrs. Morrison, took a special interest in him. She saw potential. Maybe this one could escape the trap that caught so many immigrant children. Maybe this one could become something. She was right that he would become something. She was just completely wrong about what by the time Johnny was 10 years old. He had already developed the observational skills that would later make him a criminal mastermind. He watched how the neighborhood really worked, beyond what any teacher could explain in a classroom. He saw how the Irish gangs controlled certain blocks, how the Jewish merchants paid protection money, how the cops took their bribes and looked the other way. He saw that the real power in the neighborhood didn't come from hard work or good grades. It came from understanding leverage, fear, and the unspoken rules that governed the streets. He also noticed something else that most kids missed. Violence was for idiots. The tough guys, the street brawlers, the kids who were always getting into fights, they ended up dead or in prison. The smart ones, the ones who really ran things, they stayed in the background. They didn't throw punches. They gave orders. They didn't get their hands dirty. They had other people do the dirty work. Maria remarried when Johnny was 12 to a man named Salvatore Caputo. It was a practical marriage. She needed help raising a boy who was becoming a man, and Caputo needed a wife to cook and keep house. Johnny got along with his stepfather well enough, but the relationship was cordial rather than warm. Caputo worked as a laborer, breaking his back for pennies, and Johnny could see that this was a sucker's game. His stepfather would work himself into an early grave and have nothing to show for it. As a teenager, Johnny took legitimate work to help support the family. He worked in a billiard hall, and this is where his education in the ways of the underworld truly began. The billiard hall wasn't just a place where men played pool. It was a hub of neighborhood business, both legal and otherwise. Men made deals there. Bets were placed. Stolen goods changed hands. Johnny worked behind the counter, seemingly invisible, but always watching, always listening, always learning. He learned about gambling operations, about how bookies worked, about the mathematics of odds and the psychology of gamblers. He learned that most people were predictable, driven by greed and pride in equal measure. He learned that if you understood what motivated people, you could manipulate them like puppets. But Johnny wasn't just observing, he was participating. By 15, he had organized his first criminal enterprise, and it was brilliantly simple. He recruited younger boys to work as lookouts and runners for the local gambling operations. He took a cut of everything they earned, and in return, he provided them with protection and made sure they didn't get cheated by the adults who ran the games. It was a small operation, barely worth mentioning. But it established a pattern that Johnny would follow his entire life: organization, hierarchy, and everyone getting a piece of the pie according to their position in the structure. What made Johnny different from every other young, tough guy trying to make a name in the Brooklyn underworld was his temperament. He didn't drink excessively. He didn't chase women. He didn't brag. He didn't flash money around. He was quiet, polite, and dressed conservatively. People who didn't know better thought he was a clerk or maybe a school teacher. This was exactly the impression Johnny wanted to give by 18. Johnny Torrio had made a decision that would chart the course of his entire life. He could continue to work legitimate jobs, maybe eventually save enough to open a small shop, and spend his life scraping by like his mother and stepfather. Or he could embrace the opportunities that the underworld offered, and use his intelligence to rise above the violence and chaos that trapped most criminals in early graves. He chose the underworld. But he would do it his way, with brains instead of brawn, with organization instead of chaos, with business principles instead of blind violence. Johnny started running his own pool hall, the New Brighton Athletic Club in Brooklyn. It was a legitimate business on the surface. Men could come play billiards, socialize, maybe have a drink. But in the back rooms, Johnny was operating one of the most sophisticated gambling operations in Brooklyn. Poker games, craps, sports betting. If you wanted to wager money on something, Johnny's place could accommodate you. But here's what made Johnny's operation different. It was safe. Johnny paid the cops religiously, so there were no raids. He employed bouncers who could handle trouble, so there were no fights that got out of hand. He ran honest games. The house always had an edge, but customers weren't being cheated, so they kept coming back. And Johnny kept detailed books, tracking every dollar that came in and went out. He was running a criminal enterprise like it was a legitimate corporation. Word spread through the Brooklyn underworld about this young Italian guy who was making serious money without making any noise. He wasn't stepping on anyone's toes. He wasn't trying to muscle into anyone else's territory. And he was always respectful to the established powers. The old-time gangsters, mostly Irish at this point, took notice. This kid was different. This kid had potential. Johnny also understood something that would later make him invaluable to the Chicago outfit: the power of alliances. He didn't just work with other Italians. In an era when ethnic gangs rarely cooperated across racial lines, Johnny built relationships with Irish gangsters, Jewish criminals, and anyone else who could help his business grow. He didn't care about your background, if you were smart, reliable, and good for business. Johnny wanted to work with you. One of his closest associates during these early years was Frankie Yale, a brutal enforcer who would later become one of New York's most feared gangsters. Where Johnny was all brains and calculation, Frankie was muscle and menace. They complemented each other perfectly. Frankie could handle the violent work that occasionally needed doing, while Johnny handled the planning and organization. It was a partnership that would last for decades. By his early 20s, Johnny Torrio had established himself as a rising star in Brooklyn's criminal underworld. He was making good money. He had the respect of both criminals and police. And he was building a network of contacts that stretched across the city. He dressed in expensive suits, lived in a nice apartment, and sent money back to his mother regularly. To the outside world, he looked like a successful young businessman, which, in a sense, he was. But Johnny's ambitions extended far beyond Brooklyn. He was reading about opportunities in other cities, about how the country was changing and growing. New cities were booming: Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. These places had large immigrant populations, corrupt political machines, and wide-open vice industries. For a man with vision and organizational skills, big cities represented gold mines waiting to be exploited. Johnny also understood that the way criminals operated in America was fundamentally broken. Gangs fought each other over scraps, killing each other in stupid disputes that benefited no one. They made enemies of the police when they should have been making them partners. They operated by instinct and emotion instead of careful planning. The underworld needed what the legitimate business world already had: professional management, strategic thinking, and rational organization. Johnny Torrio was going to give it to them, even if they didn't know they needed it yet. In 1909, when Johnny was 27 years old, his uncle Vittorio Torrio, who had emigrated to Chicago, reached out with a proposition. Vittorio ran a small operation in Chicago's South Side, managing several brothels and saloons in an Italian neighborhood called the Levee District. But Vittorio was getting old, and the business was getting complicated. He needed someone young, smart, and ruthless enough to handle the challenges of the Chicago underworld. He needed family. He needed Johnny. For most people, this would have been a tough decision. Johnny had built a successful operation in Brooklyn. He had his mother nearby, his associates, his comfortable life. Chicago was 1,000 miles away, a rough city with an already established underworld that didn't particularly welcome outsiders. But Johnny Torrio wasn't most people. He saw opportunity where others saw risk. Chicago was bigger than Brooklyn, growing faster, and from what he'd read, far more corrupt. The political machine there made New York's Tammany Hall look like amateur hour. In Chicago, you could buy aldermen, judges, and police captains the way you'd buy vegetables at a market. For a man who understood the value of working with authorities rather than against them. Chicago represented paradise. Johnny looked around his Brooklyn operation one last time, said goodbye to his mother, and boarded a train heading west. He was leaving behind everything he'd built. But he knew he was heading toward something much bigger. As the train rumbled through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, Johnny stared out the window at the American landscape rolling past. Farms, small towns, industrial cities belching smoke into the sky, all of it representing opportunity. He thought about what he wanted to build in Chicago. Not just a gambling operation or a brothel business, but something larger. A real organization, structured like a corporation, with different divisions, clear hierarchies, and rational management. He thought about the one thing that held back every criminal organization he'd ever observed: violence. Not that violence wasn't sometimes necessary, of course it was. But most criminals used violence as a first resort instead of a last one. They killed over insults, over small-time disputes, over ego. This was stupid and wasteful. Violence should be a business tool, used strategically and sparingly. Like any other resource, Johnny also thought about something that would later become his greatest contribution to organized crime: the idea that there was enough money for everyone. Criminal gangs fought each other constantly, each trying to monopolize whatever racket they were in. But what if instead of fighting, they cooperated? What if they carved up territory rationally, respected each other's operations, and worked together against their common enemies, the do-gooders, the reformers, the cops who wouldn't take bribes? These thoughts swirled through Johnny's mind as the train pulled into Union Station in Chicago. He stepped onto the platform carrying a single suitcase, looking like a traveling salesman or a clerk coming to the big city for a convention. No one looking at this short, soft-spoken, conservatively dressed man would have guessed that he was about to revolutionize organized crime in America. Johnny took a cab through the Chicago streets, and what he saw excited him. The city was booming, growing so fast it could barely keep up with itself. Skyscrapers were rising, immigrants were pouring in, and money was flowing like the Chicago River. This was a city that wanted to sin, and Johnny Torrio was going to give it every opportunity to do so. His uncle Vittorio met him at a brothel in the Levee district, a red light zone that operated with barely any pretense of legality. The police were paid, the politicians protected it, and the customers came in droves. Vittorio showed Johnny around, introducing him to the working girls, the bartenders, the muscle who kept order. It was a decent operation, but Johnny could see a dozen ways to improve it immediately. Within weeks, Johnny had reorganized his uncle's business. He implemented better bookkeeping. He made sure the police were paid more reliably. He established clearer rules for the employees, and he began expanding into new locations. Vittorio watched in amazement as his nephew transformed a casual, disorganized operation into something that ran like clockwork. But Johnny wasn't content to just run brothels. He saw that Chicago was ready for someone who could organize the vice industry on a massive scale. Gambling, prostitution, bootlegging, all of it was happening anyway. But it was scattered, disorganized, and vulnerable to reformers and police who occasionally decided to crack down. What Chicago needed, Johnny realized, was a real criminal organization. Not a gang, not a loose association of thugs, but something structured, disciplined, space, and impossible to destroy because it had roots deep into the political and police establishment. As Johnny settled into Chicago life, he began making the connections that would define his career. He met Big Jim Colosimo, the most powerful vice lord in Chicago at the time. He met corrupt politicians and police officials. He met other Italian immigrants who were involved in various criminal enterprises, and everywhere he went, Johnny impressed people with his intelligence, his calm demeanor, and his vision for how things could be done better. But there was one meeting still in Johnny's future that would change everything: a meeting with a young, violent, ambitious kid from Brooklyn named Alphonse Capone. That meeting was still years away, but when it happened, Johnny Torrio and Al Capone would team up to build the most sophisticated criminal organization America had ever seen. For now, though, Johnny was content to learn the Chicago landscape, build his operations, and wait for his moment. Because if there was one thing Johnny Torrio understood better than anyone, it was timing. And he knew that his time was coming. The Chicago that Johnny Torrio settled into in 1909 was a city of contradictions. Simultaneously, the most modern metropolis in America and the most corrupt. Skyscrapers pierced the sky while open sewers ran through immigrant neighborhoods. Millionaires built mansions along Lake Michigan, while workers lived 22 a room in boarding houses that should have been condemned. It was a city being built in real time, and like anything being built, the scaffolding was still visible. For a man like Johnny Torrio, that scaffolding represented opportunity. His uncle Vittorio's operation was located in the Levee District, Chicago's notorious red light zone that sprawled across the South Side. The Levee was where the city came to sin. Brothels operated openly, saloons never closed, and opium dens catered to those seeking escape from the brutal realities of industrial life. The whole district existed in a strange legal twilight. Everyone knew it was there. The police were paid to protect it, and the politicians defended it as a necessary evil. That kept vice contained to one area. But the real power in Chicago's underworld didn't belong to Johnny's uncle. It belonged to a flamboyant Italian immigrant named Gioacchino Colosimo, better known as Big Jim, if you wanted to understand how the Chicago underworld operated. You had to understand Big Jim, and Johnny Torrio made it his business to understand. Everyone who mattered Big Jim Colosimo had arrived in America as a boy and worked his way up, from street sweeper to the most powerful vice lord in Chicago. He was everything Johnny Torrio wasn't: loud, flashy, emotional. Big Jim loved the spotlight. He dressed in expensive suits with diamond stick pins. He wore rings on every finger. And he had a beautiful wife named Victoria, who was a popular singer. He owned a famous restaurant, Colosimo's Cafe, where celebrities, politicians, and gangsters all mingled together. Big Jim was living the American dream. Gangster-style. Big Jim also controlled most of the brothels, gambling dens, and saloons in the Levee District. He had the political connections to keep operating, and he had the muscle to protect his territory. When Johnny's uncle Vittorio introduced him to Big Jim in 1909, the meeting was cordial but brief. Big Jim saw Johnny as just another relative of one of his minor associates, no threat. But no particular interest either. Johnny didn't mind being underestimated. In fact, he preferred it. While Big Jim was holding court at his restaurant, Johnny was quietly learning how Chicago's vice industry really worked. He studied the political machine that protected the levee. He learned which aldermen could be bought, which police captains were already on the take, and which reform groups posed the most serious threats to the operation. He also identified the fundamental weakness in Big Jim's empire. It was built entirely on Big Jim's personal relationships and charisma. There was no real organization, no formal structure. Everything depended on Big Jim knowing people, cutting deals, and keeping everyone happy. It worked as long as Big Jim was healthy, energetic, and on top of his game. But what would happen when he got old, or sick, or when the city's power structure shifted? Johnny began making himself indispensable. He took over managing several of Big Jim's brothels, and within months, they were more profitable than they'd ever been. Johnny didn't achieve this through any revolutionary changes. He simply brought organization and efficiency to businesses that had previously operated on chaos and impulse. He kept better books. He made sure the girls were treated well enough that they didn't run away or cause problems. He established regular payment schedules for the police. He created systems that ran smoothly, whether he was there or not. Big Jim noticed. This quiet little guy from Brooklyn was making him more money without any drama or complications. When issues came up, Johnny handled them calmly and effectively. No screaming, no violence unless absolutely necessary. Just quiet competence. In 1910, Big Jim faced a problem that would change both his life and Johnny's trajectory forever. Black Hand extortionists had begun targeting him. The Black Hand was a loosely organized collection of Italian criminals who specialized in extortion, threatening violence against successful Italian businessmen, legitimate or otherwise, unless they paid protection money. They had sent Big Jim threatening letters demanding thousands of dollars. And when he initially refused, they had bombed one of his brothels. Big Jim was terrified. He was a vice lord, not a warrior. He had muscle on his payroll, but the Black Hand operators were ruthless killers who didn't care about consequences. They would kill Big Jim without hesitation if he didn't pay, and if he did pay, they'd just demand more. He was trapped. Johnny Torrio saw his opportunity. He approached Big Jim with a proposition. "Let me bring in someone from New York who can handle this situation permanently." Big Jim, desperate, agreed. Johnny sent word to his old Brooklyn associate, Frankie Yale. Within days, Frankie was on a train to Chicago with several of his most effective killers. What happened next became legend in Chicago's underworld. Frankie Yale tracked down the Black Hand extortionists and killed them one by one, with such brutal efficiency that any other potential extortionists decided that targeting Big Jim Colosimo wasn't worth the risk. Big Jim was overwhelmed with gratitude. This quiet guy Johnny had solved a problem that Big Jim himself couldn't handle. From that moment on, Big Jim's trust in Johnny Torrio was absolute. He promoted Johnny to a position just below himself in the organization. Johnny Torrio, less than 2 years after arriving in Chicago, had become the second most powerful vice lord in the city. But Johnny wasn't satisfied with being second. He could see that Big Jim, for all his success, lacked vision. Big Jim was content to run his brothels and gambling dens and live the good life. He had no interest in expanding, no interest in organizing the underworld into something larger. He just wanted to maintain what he had and enjoy his success. Johnny wanted more. He wanted to build something that would outlast any individual. He wanted to transform the scattered, chaotic Chicago underworld into a real business empire. Over the next several years, Johnny systematically expanded the organization. He opened new brothels in surrounding suburbs where local politicians were eager for the revenue that vice brought. He established relationships with criminals in other cities, creating networks for importing illegal goods and exporting stolen merchandise. He professionalized the operation's finances, keeping detailed books that tracked every dollar earned and spent. He also began building the relationship that would define the rest of his career. In 1919, Johnny made a trip back to Brooklyn to visit old friends and check on his aging mother. While there, he stopped by a bar run by his old associate, Frankie Yale. Behind the bar was a young, tough guy, 20 years old, with a prominent scar on his face from a knife fight. His name was Alphonse Capone, but everyone called him Al. Johnny and Frankie Yale sat in a booth talking business while young Al Capone served drinks. Johnny watched the kid work. He saw that Al was smart, attentive, and clearly ambitious. He also saw something else, a capacity for violence that was both useful and dangerous. Al Capone could hurt people without hesitation, without remorse. This made him valuable, but it also made him a liability if not properly controlled. When Johnny mentioned that he was looking for someone to come to Chicago and help manage some of his operations, Frankie Yale immediately suggested Al. "The kid's smart. He's tough and he's loyal," Frankie said. "He's also getting into too much trouble here in Brooklyn. The cops know him. Some of the rival gangs have it out for him. A fresh start in Chicago might be good for everyone." Johnny looked at Al Capone looked at him. He saw ambition burning in those eyes, saw a young man who wanted desperately to be somebody. Johnny understood that hunger because he'd felt it himself at that age. The difference was that Johnny had always controlled his ambition with discipline and calculation. Al Capone would need someone to channel his ambition, to direct his violence, to teach him that brains beat brawn every time. "Can you take orders?" Johnny asked Al directly. Al Capone, to his credit, understood the opportunity being presented. "Yes, sir," he said respectfully. "I'm a good learner, and I work hard." Johnny nodded. "Come to Chicago. I'll start you as a bouncer in one of our clubs. You'll make good money, and if you're as smart as Frankie says, you'll move up quickly. But understand this: in my organization, we think before we act. We don't draw unnecessary attention. We handle problems quietly. Can you do that?" Al Capone nodded eagerly. Within weeks, he had packed his bags, said goodbye to his family in Brooklyn, and boarded a train for Chicago. Neither he nor Johnny Torrio could have known it then. But this decision would reshape American organized crime. Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919. The same year that would change everything for Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, and every criminal in America. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages in the United States. Prohibition, the single greatest gift the United States government ever gave to organized crime. Johnny Torrio understood immediately what this meant. Most gangsters saw Prohibition as a problem their saloons and bars would have to close, cutting off a revenue stream. But Johnny saw it differently. He saw the biggest business opportunity in American history. Americans weren't going to stop drinking just because the government said so. If anything, making alcohol illegal would make people want it more. Someone was going to supply that alcohol, and whoever did would make unimaginable amounts of money. The question wasn't whether there would be a bootlegging industry. The question was, who would control it? Johnny Torrio intended to control it, at least in Chicago. But first, he had an obstacle: Big Jim Colosimo. When Johnny approached his boss with plans to move heavily into bootlegging, Big Jim refused. He was making plenty of money from brothels and gambling. He didn't want the heat that bootlegging would bring, and he was distracted by a new romance. Big Jim had divorced his wife Victoria and fallen madly in love with a young singer named Dale Winter. He was 50 years old and acting like a teenager, more interested in courting his new girlfriend than in building criminal empires. Johnny tried to convince him. He laid out the numbers, showed him how much money they could make, explained how they could organize the bootlegging business to minimize risk. But Big Jim wouldn't listen. He wanted to maintain his comfortable vice empire and enjoy his golden years with his new love. He had no vision, no ambition beyond his own immediate pleasure. Johnny Torrio made a decision. It was a decision he didn't make lightly, because Johnny wasn't a killer by nature. He preferred negotiation, cooperation, rational business arrangements. But Big Jim was standing in the way of an opportunity that would never come again. And in the underworld, when someone becomes an obstacle to progress, there's really only one solution. On May 11, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo was sitting in the lobby of his restaurant, waiting for a shipment delivery. A man walked in, pulled out a gun, and shot Big Jim in the head. He died instantly, sprawled on the floor of the restaurant that bore his name, surrounded by the symbols of the success he had built. The murder was never officially solved. But everyone in Chicago's underworld knew who had ordered it. Johnny Torrio had removed the obstacle standing between him and criminal empire. He had done it cleanly, quietly, and with enough plausible deniability that the police couldn't touch him. Big Jim's funeral was enormous. Thousands attended. Politicians gave eulogies. and newspapers wrote glowing obituaries about the colorful vice lord. But behind the scenes, power had already transferred to Johnny Torrio at 38 years old. Johnny Torrio now controlled the largest vice organization in Chicago, and he was about to turn it into something the country had never seen before: a modern, professional criminal corporation. Johnny's first move was to organize the bootlegging business with the same efficiency he'd brought to brothels and gambling. He established breweries that operated under the cover of legitimate businesses. He created distribution networks that moved alcohol from Canada, from industrial manufacturers, and from his own illegal breweries to speakeasies throughout Chicago. He set up accounting systems that tracked inventory, payoffs to police and politicians, and profits. He also did something revolutionary. He began negotiating treaties with rival gangs. Instead of fighting over territory, Johnny proposed that they divide Chicago into territories, with each gang controlling bootlegging in their own area. Everyone would respect everyone else's territory, and they would cooperate against common enemies: the police who wouldn't take bribes, the federal agents, and the reform groups trying to enforce prohibition. Many gang leaders agreed to Johnny's proposal. The Irish gangs on the north side, the Polish gangs on the west side, various Italian groups. Johnny met with all of them, proposing cooperation instead of conflict. He argued persuasively that there was enough money for everyone. Why kill each other over scraps when they could all get rich by working together? Not every gang leader agreed. Some, particularly Dean O'Banion, who led the North Side Gang, saw Johnny's peace proposal as weakness. They continued to encroach on territories, hijack shipments, and generally cause trouble. Johnny handled these challenges with patience, always trying negotiation first. But he was also prepared to use violence when necessary. And this is where Al Capone became invaluable. While Johnny was the brains and the diplomat, Al Capone was the enforcer. Under Johnny's guidance, Al had risen quickly through the organization. He was smart enough to learn the business side. Johnny taught him about accounting, about political connections, about how to structure operations for maximum efficiency. But Al also had a talent for violence that Johnny lacked. When someone needed to be intimidated, beaten, or killed, Al Capone could handle it personally or organize it through others. Together, Johnny Torrio and Al Capone built the Chicago outfit into the most sophisticated criminal organization in America. They weren't just bootleggers. They controlled brothels, gambling operations, nightclubs, and had politicians and police on their payroll throughout the city and suburbs. They operated like a corporation with different divisions for different rackets, managers overseeing each operation, and clear lines of authority running up to Johnny at the top. The money was staggering. By 1923, the Chicago outfit was earning an estimated $100 million a year, equivalent to billions in today's money. Johnny Torrio, the quiet immigrant from Brooklyn, had become one of the richest criminals in American history. But success attracted attention and enemies. Federal agents began investigating the outfit. Reform groups in Chicago demanded action against gangsters who were openly flouting prohibition. And rival gangs, particularly Dean O'Banion's North Side Gang, continued to challenge the outfit's dominance. The tension with O'Banion reached a breaking point in 1924. O'Banion had been hijacking the outfit's beer trucks, encroaching on their territory, and generally proving that he had no interest in Johnny's vision of peaceful cooperation. Johnny tried reasoning with him, tried negotiating new arrangements, but O'Banion saw Johnny's patience as weakness. Finally, Johnny made another difficult decision. On November 10, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's flower shop and shot him dead. The killing sparked a gang war that would rage in Chicago for years. But it also sent a clear message. Johnny Torrio preferred peace, but he was prepared for war. The O'Banion killing proved to be a mistake, though not for the reason you might think. The problem wasn't that O'Banion was killed, he had made himself impossible to work with. The problem was that his death ignited exactly the kind of chaos and violence that Johnny had been trying to avoid. O'Banion's successors, particularly a psychotic killer named Jaime Weiss, were even more violent and less reasonable than O'Banion had been. They declared all-out war on the Chicago outfit. On January 24, 1925, Johnny Torrio was returning to his apartment building after a shopping trip with his wife Anna. As he stepped out of his car, a car full of Northside gang members pulled up and opened fire. Bullets hit Johnny in the chest, neck, and jaw. He collapsed on the street, bleeding heavily, while his terrified wife screamed for help. The assassins approached to finish the job, but their guns were empty. As they fumbled to reload, a shop owner came running out with his own gun, and the assassins fled. Johnny Torrio, the mastermind of Chicago's underworld, lay in a spreading pool of his own blood, clinging to life by a thread. He survived, barely. Surgeons removed the bullets and somehow patched him back together. But Johnny Torrio was never the same after that day. He spent weeks recovering in a hospital room, heavily guarded by Al Capone's men. And as he lay in that hospital bed, Johnny Torrio had time to think about his life, his choices, and what he really wanted. He had built an empire. He had proven that a criminal organization could operate with the efficiency and professionalism of a legitimate corporation. He had made more money than he could ever spend. But he had also just come within seconds of dying in the street, shot down by rivals who would never stop trying to kill him as long as he remained in power. Johnny Torrio was 43 years old. He was wealthy beyond measure. He had a wife who loved him and wanted him to retire before the next assassination attempt succeeded. And he had Al Capone, who had learned everything Johnny could teach him and was ready to take over. When Al Capone visited him in the hospital, Johnny made a decision that shocked everyone in the Chicago underworld. "It's yours," he told Al. "The whole operation. I'm done." Al Capone couldn't believe what he was hearing. Johnny was handing him control of the largest criminal organization in America. "But boss," Al protested, "you built this. You can't just walk away." Johnny smiled, or tried to. His jaw was still wired shut from the bullet wounds. "I can and I will," he said. "I've done what I set out to do. I proved that organized crime could be organized. I built something that will last. But I'm not interested in dying for it. You take over. You're ready. Just remember everything I taught you: brains beat brawn, organization beats chaos. And there's enough for everyone if people are smart enough to cooperate." It was an astonishing moment in criminal history. At the height of his power, Johnny Torrio voluntarily gave up his empire and walked away. He would serve a brief jail sentence for a minor prohibition violation. And then he would retire to New York, invest his money in legitimate businesses, and live quietly for the rest of his life. But before he left Chicago, Johnny Torrio had one more lesson to teach Al Capone. And it was the most important lesson of all: when to walk away. Success in the criminal world wasn't just about gaining power, it was about knowing when you'd pushed your luck far enough. When the odds turned against you, when it was time to cash out and enjoy what you'd built. Al Capone would learn this lesson too late. But Johnny Torrio learned it just in time. Before we can truly understand the empire Johnny Torrio built, we need to appreciate the scale of what Prohibition made possible. When the 18th Amendment took effect on January 17, 1920, it didn't just ban alcohol, it created the largest black market in American history overnight. Suddenly, something that had been completely legal and that millions of Americans consumed daily became contraband. It was as if the government had criminalized breathing and then acted surprised when people broke the law. For Johnny Torrio, Prohibition was like Christmas, his birthday, and hitting the lottery all at once. Here was an entire nation of potential customers who wanted a product that was now illegal to sell. Supply and demand hadn't changed, only the legal framework. And unlike gambling or prostitution, which had always existed in moral gray areas, alcohol had been mainstream. Respectable people drank. Wealthy people drank. Politicians drank. The very politicians who voted for Prohibition drank. The hypocrisy was stunning. And Johnny understood how to exploit it perfectly. By 1922, just 2 years after Big Jim Colosimo's death, Johnny had transformed a regional vice operation into a criminal empire that stretched across Chicago and into the surrounding suburbs. The structure he created was remarkably sophisticated for its time. In fact, it anticipated the corporate organizational models that legitimate businesses wouldn't adopt for decades. At the top of the pyramid sat Johnny himself, making strategic decisions, negotiating with politicians, and maintaining relationships with other criminal organizations. He didn't run anything directly, he orchestrated. Below him were division heads responsible for specific rackets, bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and labor racketeering. Each division operated semi-independently, but reported up through clear chains of command. The bootlegging operation alone was a marvel of logistics and planning. Johnny controlled several breweries that ostensibly produced near beer with less than 0.5% alcohol, which was technically legal. In reality, these breweries were producing full-strength beer that was then distributed through a network of speakeasies, nightclubs, and restaurants throughout the Chicago area. Johnny also imported high-quality whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, and wine from California, creating a diversified product portfolio that would make any legitimate distributor proud. To move all this alcohol required an extensive transportation network. Johnny employed hundreds of drivers who hauled liquor in trucks, disguised as delivery vehicles for legitimate businesses. He had warehouses throughout the city where alcohol was stored before distribution. He even had his own mechanics who modified vehicles to outrun police cars. This was where the term souped up came from. Gangsters creating faster cars to escape the law. But the real genius of Johnny's empire wasn't the production or distribution, it was the protection. Johnny understood that the biggest threat to his business wasn't rival gangs, though they were certainly a problem. The biggest threat was law enforcement. So Johnny made law enforcement part of his business model. He had police officers on the payroll throughout Chicago. Not just beat cops captains, detectives, even members of the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau. These weren't just bribes paid occasionally to look the other way. Johnny put law enforcement officers on regular salary, paying them monthly like any other employees. In return, they warned him about raids, arrested his competitors, generally made sure his operations ran smoothly. Johnny took the same approach with politicians. He contributed heavily to political campaigns, delivered votes through his network of saloons and brothels, and maintained relationships with aldermen, judges, and even the mayor's office. When Johnny needed a liquor license for a speakeasy, a favorable court ruling, or a zoning variance for a gambling den, he had people in place to make it happen at his peak. Johnny Torrio was spending an estimated $30 million a year on bribes and political contributions, which gives you some sense of how much money was flowing through his organization. Even after paying off everyone who needed paying, Johnny was still clearing tens of millions in profit annually. The speakeasies themselves represented another innovation. Before Prohibition, most drinking establishments had been working-class saloons or upper-class gentlemen's clubs. The speakeasy changed this dynamic entirely. Because they were illegal anyway, speakeasies welcomed women, which had been unusual in saloons. They featured jazz music, dancing, and a sophisticated atmosphere that attracted people from all social classes. Going to a speakeasy wasn't just about drinking, it was about rebellion, excitement, and sophistication. Johnny understood the psychology perfectly. He opened clubs that catered to different clientele, some rough joints for working-class guys who just wanted cheap beer. Others upscale establishments where society ladies could pretend they were being daring by drinking illegal cocktails. The Four Deuces, one of the outfit's most famous clubs, had a ground-floor bar, gambling on the second floor, and a brothel on the third and fourth floors. It was one-stop shopping for vice, and it made money hand over fist. But running this empire required more than just business acumen, required managing dangerous, violent men who didn't respond well to typical corporate management techniques. This is where Johnny's relationship with Al Capone became essential. Johnny had brought Al to Chicago as a bouncer, but he'd quickly recognized the young man's potential. Al was smart, ambitious, and willing to learn. Under Johnny's mentorship, Al absorbed everything he could about running criminal operations. Johnny taught him accounting, showed him how to structure deals, explained the importance of political connections, and demonstrated why organization beat chaos every time. But Johnny also recognized and utilized Al's greatest asset, his capacity for violence. Johnny himself wasn't particularly violent. He'd ordered hits when necessary, but he didn't enjoy it and he didn't do it casually. Al Capone was different. Al could beat someone with his bare hands, shoot someone in the face, or order mass killings without losing sleep. This made him simultaneously invaluable and dangerous. Johnny positioned Al as his enforcer and eventual successor. When someone needed to be intimidated, Al handled it. When a rival gang needed to be taught a lesson, Al organized it. When negotiations failed and violence became necessary, Al made it happen. Johnny stayed in the background, the respectable businessman, while Al built a reputation as a vicious enforcer. This division of labor worked brilliantly for years. Johnny could meet with politicians and police officials without them having to acknowledge they were dealing with a killer. Al could handle the dirty work without having to navigate the political complexities that Johnny managed. Together, built something unprecedented in American organized crime. The money they made was almost impossible to comprehend. By 1924, the Chicago outfit was earning approximately $100 million annually. That's roughly $1.5 billion in today's money. Johnny himself was worth tens of millions. He owned legitimate businesses as fronts, invested in real estate, and had money tucked away in banks under various names. He could have retired at any point and lived in luxury for the rest of his life. But money wasn't really what drove Johnny Torrio. What drove him was the intellectual challenge of building something complex and making it work. He was an engineer at heart, but instead of building bridges or machines, he built criminal organizations. The empire itself was his masterpiece. However, every empire has its rivals. And Johnny's greatest rival was a man named Dean O'Banion. O'Banion controlled the north side of Chicago. And he was everything Johnny wasn't. Where Johnny was quiet and calculating, O'Banion was loud and impulsive. Where Johnny believed in cooperation between gangs, O'Banion believed in taking what he wanted. Where Johnny tried to avoid violence, O'Banion seemed to enjoy it. O'Banion ran a florist shop as his front business, which might sound quaint until you realize he was also one of the most prolific killers in Chicago. He'd murdered dozens of people personally and had ordered the deaths of dozens more. He hijacked outfit beer trucks, encroached on outfit territory, and generally showed complete contempt for Johnny's vision of peaceful coexistence. Johnny tried everything to accommodate O'Banion. He negotiated new territory agreements. He overlooked minor violations. He paid compensation when disputes arose. But O'Banion interpreted Johnny's patience as weakness. He kept pushing, kept taking more, kept showing disrespect. The final straw came when O'Banion set Johnny up with the police. O'Banion sold Johnny a brewery, claiming he wanted out of that business. But it was a trap O'Banion had already tipped off the police, who raided the brewery right after Johnny bought it. Johnny and Al Capone were both arrested, though they were quickly released after paying the usual bribes. But the incident humiliated Johnny and demonstrated that O'Banion couldn't be trusted even in business dealings. Johnny made the decision. O'Banion had to go. On November 10, 1924, 3 men walked into O'Banion's flower shop. O'Banion greeted them warmly, thinking they were customers. One of the men shook O'Banion's hand and held it, while the other 2 pulled guns and shot him 6 times in the chest and head. He died surrounded by the flowers he sold for funerals, never imagining his own funeral was seconds away. The killing of Dean O'Banion was supposed to solve Johnny's problem with the North Side Gang. Instead, it created a much worse problem. Gang war, O'Banion, successors, particularly Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, declared total war on the Chicago outfit. They weren't interested in negotiation, territory agreements, or peaceful coexistence. They wanted revenge, and they wanted to destroy Johnny Torrio. The streets of Chicago turned into a war zone. Gangsters were killed in shootouts almost weekly. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. Newspapers ran daily stories about the gang violence, with maps showing where the latest killing had occurred. Federal authorities began paying more attention to Chicago, threatening the comfortable arrangements Johnny had built with local law enforcement. And then came January 24, 1925, the day that changed everything. Johnny had just returned from a shopping trip with his wife Anna. It was a Saturday afternoon, cold and overcast, the kind of Chicago winter day where the wind cuts through your coat like it has personal grudge against you. Johnny's driver pulled up to his apartment building on South Clyde Avenue. Johnny got out, carrying packages, thinking about nothing more dangerous than what they'd have for dinner. A car came around the corner. Johnny heard the engine first, then saw the vehicle accelerating toward him. He had maybe 2 seconds to realize what was happening before the shooting started. Bullets tore through the air, through his packages, through his body. He felt impacts in his chest, his neck, his jaw. The pain was beyond description, like being hit by lightning made of fire. He collapsed on the sidewalk, dropping his packages, blood pouring from multiple wounds. His wife Anna screamed, a sound of pure animal terror. The car screeched to a stop. Men got out, walking toward Johnny's fallen body to finish the job. This was it. Johnny Torrio, who had built an empire with his brain, was going to die on a Chicago sidewalk, shot down like a dog. Then the assassins' guns clicked empty. They'd fired all their ammunition into Johnny, but somehow hadn't managed to kill him. As they fumbled to reload, a shop owner came running out with his own gun. And the assassins fled, their job incomplete. Johnny lay on the cold sidewalk, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds, his wife crying over him. And all he could think was, this is what it comes to. All the planning, all the organization, all the intelligence, and I'm dying in the street like any common thug. Except he didn't die. Somehow, miraculously, none of the bullets had hit vital organs. Surgeons operated for hours, removing bullets from his chest, neck, and jaw. His jaw was shattered, requiring wiring that would leave him unable to speak normally for months. But he survived. As Johnny recovered in his hospital bed, heavily guarded by Al Capone's men, he had time to think. Really think about his life, his choices, and what he wanted from whatever time he had left. He'd proven what he set out to prove. He'd shown that organized crime could be truly organized, run like a business with structure and professionalism. He'd made more money than he'd ever dreamed possible. He'd built an empire that would outlast him. But he'd also just come within seconds of dying in the street, and it was only dumb luck that the assassins had run out of bullets. Next time, man, there would be a next time he might not be so lucky. Johnny Torrio was 43 years old. He was wealthy. He had a wife who loved him. And he had Al Capone, ready and able to take over the organization. Why stay? Why keep rolling the dice when he'd already won the game? When Al Capone visited him in the hospital, Johnny dropped the bombshell. It's yours. Take it all. I'm done. Al couldn't believe it. Johnny was voluntarily giving up power, something virtually no gangster in history had ever done. "But boss," Al protested, "you can't just quit. We need you." Johnny smiled, or tried to. His wired jaw made it difficult. "You don't need me anymore, Al. I've taught you everything I know. You're ready. You've been ready for a while. Take the operation. Run it the way I taught you. Build on what we've created. And Al," Johnny's expression became serious, "learn from my mistake. Know when to walk away. Don't wait until they get luckier with their aim." It was the most important lesson Johnny Torrio ever taught Al Capone. Unfortunately, it was a lesson Al would fail to learn. Johnny served 9 months in jail for a minor prohibition violation time he used to recuperate fully from his wounds. When he was released in October 1925, he did something remarkable. He actually retired. He moved back to New York with his wife Anna, invested his money in legitimate businesses, and lived quietly for the rest of his life. He'd occasionally consult for other gangsters, offering advice and helping negotiate disputes, but his days of running criminal empires were over. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd revolutionized organized crime, turning it from scattered gangs into professional organizations. He'd proven that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. He'd built the template that every major criminal organization for the next century would follow. And most remarkably, he'd survived. In a profession where the average life expectancy could be measured in months, Johnny Torrio lived to be 75 years old, dying peacefully of a heart attack in 1957, surrounded by family and dying wealthy, enough to have never needed to work another day after leaving Chicago. The empire he built continued under Al Capone's leadership, growing even larger and more notorious. But the foundation, the structure, the entire concept of organized crime as an organized business, that was all. Johnny Torrio. History remembers Al Capone as the face of Chicago's criminal empire. But anyone who understands how that empire really worked knows the truth. Johnny Torrio was the brains, the architect, the man who made it all possible. His empire became infamous. But Johnny himself remained what he'd always been: quiet, calculating, and smart enough to know when to walk away. That's a lesson that distinguished him from almost every other gangster in history. And it's why he died in his bed, while nearly everyone else in his profession died in streets, prison cells, or electric chairs. Johnny Torrio had always understood something fundamental that most gangsters never grasped in the criminal world. There's no such thing as permanent victory. You could win 100 battles, build an empire, become untouchable. One unlucky moment could end it all. He'd seen it happen to others. He'd made it happen to others. And on that freezing January afternoon in 1925, lying on a Chicago sidewalk with bullets in his body and his blood pooling beneath him, Johnny learned this lesson in the most personal way possible. But here's what made Johnny different from virtually every other gangster in American history. He actually learned from it. The weeks following the assassination attempt were the most introspective of Johnny's life. As he lay in his hospital bed, jaw wired shut, breathing painful from the chest wounds, surrounded by armed guards who were supposed to prevent a second attempt on his life, Johnny had time to think. Really think. Not about business strategies or political connections or territory disputes, but about what he was doing with his life and whether it was worth dying for. The empire he'd built was magnificent. The Chicago outfit under his leadership had become the most sophisticated criminal organization in America. They were earning $100 million a year, had hundreds of politicians and police on the payroll, and controlled vice operations across Chicago and the surrounding area. Johnny himself was worth tens of millions of dollars more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But what was it all for? What had he really accomplished? He'd proven that organized crime could be organized. He'd shown that cooperation beat conflict, that brains beat brawn, that long-term thinking beat short-term greed. These weren't small achievements. Johnny had essentially invented modern organized crime, creating the template that would be copied by criminal organizations for the next century. But in the process, he'd also made himself a target. The North Side gang wanted him dead. Other rivals saw him as an obstacle. Reform politicians saw him as public enemy number one. Federal agents were building cases against him. And every day he stayed in Chicago, he was rolling dice with death. Johnny had always been rational, analytical. He approached problems like mathematical equations, calculating odds and outcomes. Now, lying in a hospital bed, he calculated the odds of his own survival if he stayed in the game. The equation wasn't complicated. If he remained the head of the Chicago outfit, someone would try to kill him again. Maybe they'd fail again. But probably they wouldn't. The next assassin might be luckier or better prepared. We'll just catch him at a more vulnerable moment. His wife Anna drove the point home. She'd always been supportive of Johnny's work, accepting the lifestyle that his criminal activities provided. But watching her husband get shot down on the street had broken something in her. She visited him in the hospital, held his hand, and said simply, "Johnny, I can't lose you. We have enough money. Please, let's just go home to New York and live quietly. Haven't you done enough?" It was a good question. Had he done enough? For most gangsters, the answer would have been an automatic no. There's always more territory to conquer, more money to make, more enemies to defeat. The game is everything. The power is addictive. Walking away seems like surrender, like weakness. But Johnny had always been smarter than most gangsters. He'd never been driven primarily by ego or the need to prove his toughness. He'd been driven by the intellectual challenge of building something complex and making it work. And he'd done that. The Chicago outfit was his masterpiece, his proof of concept. He'd shown what was possible. What more did he need to prove? Al Capone visited him regularly during his recovery. Al had grown from the young tough guy Johnny recruited in Brooklyn into a formidable gangster in his own right. Under Johnny's mentorship, Al had learned the business, built relationships, and demonstrated both the intelligence to run complex operations and the ruthlessness to handle problems with violence when necessary. He was ready to take over, maybe more ready than Johnny had realized. During one visit, Johnny made his decision. "Al, I'm done. I'm giving you the whole operation. Everything." Al stared at him, genuinely shocked. In the gangster world, you didn't retire. You either died, went to prison, or stayed in the game until one of those things happened. No one, absolutely no one voluntarily gave up power. "Boss, you can't be serious," Al said. "You built this. It's yours." "I built it, yes," Johnny replied, his voice rough from his jaw. "Injuries. But I built it to last. I built it so it didn't depend on any one person, even me. You've learned everything I can teach you. You're ready to run it. And I." Johnny paused, touching his bandaged jaw. "I'm ready to not get shot again." "But what about the war with the North Side?" "What about all the 'you'll handle it'?" Johnny interrupted. "You're smarter than they are, and you're meaner when you need to be. You'll figure it out." "But Al, listen to me, this is important." Johnny leaned forward, wincing at the pain. "Know when to walk away. I mean it. This life, it has an expiration date. For most guys, that date comes when they're lying face down in the street or sitting in the electric chair. Don't be most guys. Build what you want to build, make your money, and then get out while you're still alive to enjoy it." Al nodded, but Johnny could see the young man didn't really understand. How could he? Al was still hungry, still building his reputation, still proving himself. He hadn't yet reached the point where he'd seen enough, done enough, won enough. He couldn't imagine walking away, but Johnny could. In fact, he could barely imagine staying. There was still the matter of the law to deal with. Johnny had been indicted for a minor prohibition violation, nothing that would normally result in significant jail time, especially given his connections. But in this case, Johnny actually wanted to serve the time. 9 months in jail would give him a legitimate reason to step back from active management of the outfit. It would give Al time to consolidate power without anyone thinking Johnny was being forced out. And most importantly, it would give Johnny time to fully recover from his injuries under the protection of prison walls, where the North Side gang couldn't get to him. On May 22, 1925, Johnny Torrio pleaded guilty to the prohibition charge and was sentenced to 9 months in jail. He served his time at the Waukesha County Jail in Wisconsin, at a particularly harsh facility, especially for someone with Johnny's connections and money. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it wasn't terrible either. Johnny used the time to read, think, and plan his retirement. Meanwhile, Al Capone took control of the Chicago outfit. The transition was remarkably smooth, which testified to how well Johnny had structured the organization. Everything was already in place. The political connections, the operational systems. Al didn't need to rebuild anything. He just needed to maintain what Johnny had created and handle the ongoing war with the North Side Gang. Al threw himself into the role with characteristic enthusiasm. Where Johnny had been understated and subtle, Al was flashy and bold. He dressed in expensive suits, drove fancy cars, and seemed to enjoy the celebrity that came with being a gangster. The newspapers loved him, writing stories about Scarface, Al Capone, and his criminal empire. Al became famous in a way Johnny never had been and never wanted to be, but Al also proved to be a capable leader. He expanded the bootlegging operations, opened new gambling establishments, and maintained the political connections that Johnny had built. The money kept flowing, the outfit kept growing. And Chicago remained the crown jewel of American organized crime. When Johnny was released from jail in October 1925, he found that his empire had transitioned seamlessly to Al's leadership. Everything was running smoothly. His work was done. Johnny and Anna moved back to New York. They settled into a quiet life in Brooklyn, not far from where Johnny had grown up. He invested his considerable wealth in legitimate businesses, real estate, stocks, various commercial ventures. He lived in a nice but not ostentatious apartment. He dressed conservatively. To neighbors and casual acquaintances, he seemed like a successful businessman, perhaps an investor or a consultant. Nothing suggested that this quiet, middle-aged man had recently been one of the most powerful gangsters in America. But Johnny wasn't completely out of the game. He couldn't be. Other gangsters knew who he was and what he'd accomplished, and they sought his advice. Johnny became a kind of elder statesman of organized crime, a consultant who would meet with other criminal leaders to help them negotiate disputes, structure operations, or solve organizational problems. He was particularly involved in the early development of what would become known as the Commission-era, kind of board of directors for organized crime that brought together leaders from different cities and different ethnic groups to settle disputes, divide territories, and coordinate major operations. This was Johnny's ultimate vision realized. Cooperation instead of conflict, organization instead of chaos. Rational business principles applied to the criminal world. The commission wouldn't be formally established until the early 1930s, under the leadership of younger gangsters like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. But the concept came from Johnny Torrio. He'd been preaching it since the early 1920s, and now, even in semi-retirement, he was helping make it a reality. However, Johnny's fall from grace wasn't really a fall at all. It was a strategic retreat, a calculated decision to walk away while he was still ahead. But that doesn't mean there weren't consequences to his years as a gangster. For one thing, Johnny could never be completely legitimate. His past was too well known, too thoroughly documented in police files and newspaper archives. He would always be watched by law enforcement, always suspected of involvement in any major crimes in New York. This meant he had to be careful, constantly aware that one mistake could land him back in prison with much more serious charges than a simple prohibition violation. There was also the emotional toll. Johnny had ordered the deaths of dozens of people, including Big Jim Colosimo, a man who had brought him to Chicago and treated him like a son. Johnny wasn't a psychopath who enjoyed killing, but he wasn't bothered by guilt either. He'd done what he thought necessary for business. But that kind of moral compartmentalization exacts a price. Johnny became increasingly withdrawn, preferring the company of his wife and a small circle of old friends to any kind of social life, and there was always the threat of revenge. The North Side Gang had tried to kill him once. Various other enemies from his Chicago years might still harbor grudges. Johnny had to remain cautious, always aware of his surroundings, never completely relaxed. It was a wearing way to live. Even in retirement, the 1930s brought new challenges for organized crime as a whole, and for Johnny's legacy in particular. The end of Prohibition in 1933 eliminated the criminal world's biggest revenue source. Federal law enforcement, particularly the newly empowered FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, began seriously targeting organized crime figures. The easy years were over. Al Capone, Johnny's protege and successor, demonstrated both the wisdom of Johnny's organizational innovations and the consequences of not following Johnny's most important advice: know when to walk away. Al had become incredibly successful, probably the most famous gangster in American history. But he'd also become incredibly conspicuous. The government couldn't get him on murder or bootlegging, but they got him on tax evasion. In 1931, Al was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. Johnny visited Al during the trial. They met in a private room, and Johnny looked at his former protege with sadness. "I told you," Johnny said simply. "I told you to know when to walk away." Al, still defiant despite the conviction, shook his head. "I couldn't, boss. You know I couldn't. I'm not built like you." "No," Johnny agreed. "You're not. But you could have learned." Al Capone would serve nearly 8 years in prison, including time at Alcatraz, and emerge in 1939 with his health destroyed by syphilis. He would die in 1947, a physical and mental wreck, unable to even remember his days of glory. The man who had ruled Chicago died helpless and confused. A cautionary tale about the price of staying in the game too long. Johnny, meanwhile, lived quietly through the 1930s and 1940s. He survived the Depression comfortably, his diversified investments and careful savings providing more than enough to live on. He and Anna had no children, but they seemed content with each other's company. They traveled occasionally, visited relatives, and lived the kind of quiet, bourgeois life that seemed impossible for someone with Johnny's past. But the past never completely releases its grip. In 1939, Johnny was called to testify before a grand jury investigating organized crime. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination for virtually every question. But the questioning itself was stressful and reminded him he would never be completely free of his history. There were occasional scares, times when Johnny thought he'd been recognized, times when he worried that old enemies might be catching up to him. But the years passed and nothing happened. The men who'd tried to kill him in 1925 were long dead themselves, killed in the gang wars that Johnny had walked away from. The organization he'd built had evolved and changed. But the basic structure remained his legacy, his proof that he'd been right about how to run organized crime. Johnny's wife Anna died in 1947, and her death hit him hard. They'd been together through everything: the rise to power, the assassination attempt, the retirement. She'd been the one constant in his life, the person who knew him completely and loved him anyway. Without her, Johnny became even more reclusive. spending his days reading, thinking, passionately meeting with old friends from the criminal world, who sought his advice. The 1950s arrived, and Johnny Torrio was in his 70s, an old man in a world that had changed dramatically from the one he'd dominated. The gangsters he'd known were mostly dead or in prison. The organizations they'd built had been transformed by new laws, new law enforcement techniques, and new generations of criminals. But the basic principles Johnny had, established organization, cooperation, political corruption, diversified criminal enterprise, remained the foundation of organized crime in America. In a way, Johnny's fall from grace was the most graceful exit in criminal history. He'd built an empire, voluntarily gave it up, and lived for decades enjoying the fruits of his criminal career without suffering the typical consequences. No prison sentences beyond those initial 9 months. No violent death in the streets. No dramatic downfall, just a quiet retirement, a long life, and the satisfaction of knowing that he'd revolutionized his chosen field. On April 16, 1957, 75-year-old Johnny Torrio suffered a heart attack while sitting in a barber's chair in Brooklyn. He died within minutes, quickly, and without much pain. It was about as good a death as anyone could hope for, and far better than what most gangsters received. His funeral was modest. No thousands of mourners like at Big Jim Colosimo's funeral. No newspaper headlines like when Al Capone died. Just family, a few old friends, and quiet respect for a man who'd lived a remarkable life. The newspapers that did mention his death described him simply as a retired businessman or former Prohibition figure. Few people reading those obituaries would have understood who Johnny Torrio really was or what he'd accomplished. But in the underworld, among the people who knew, his death marked the end of an era. Johnny Torrio had fallen from grace in the sense that he'd left behind the power, excitement, and danger of running a criminal empire. But he'd done so on his own terms at a time of his choosing. And he'd lived long enough to see that he'd been right about everything. That's not a fall from grace. That's mastery of fate. The story of Johnny Torrio should have ended with his death in 1957. But in many ways, that's where it truly begins. Because the measure of any revolutionary isn't just what they accomplish in their lifetime. It's how their ideas reshape the world after they're gone. And by that standard, Johnny Torrio might be the most influential criminal in American history, even though most people have never heard his name. Let's start with the obvious legacy. Johnny invented modern organized crime. Before him, criminal gangs were exactly that, gangs. Loose associations of thugs who fought each other over territory, operated on emotion and impulse, and typically ended up dead or in prison within a few years. They were criminals, but they weren't organized. Johnny changed everything. He took the chaotic, violent world of early 20th century crime and applied business principles to it. He created hierarchies, divisions of labor, professional management structures. He established territories and negotiated treaties between competing organizations. He understood that cooperation was more profitable than conflict, that bribing police was smarter than fighting them, and that long-term strategic planning beats short-term tactical victories. This wasn't just an incremental improvement, which was a complete reimagining of how criminal enterprises could operate. And every major organized crime group that came after him used some version of Johnny's template. The Italian mafia families in New York, which rose to dominance in the 1930s and 1940s, under leaders like Lucky Luciano and Carlo Gambino, operated according to principles Johnny had established. The commission itself, the governing body that brought together leaders from different families to settle disputes and coordinate operations, was essentially Johnny's vision of organized cooperation made permanent. The Chicago outfit that Al Capone inherited from Johnny remained one of America's most powerful criminal organizations for decades. eventually coming under the control of more sophisticated leaders like Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo. But the structure Johnny built in the 1920s remained largely intact, testament to how well he'd designed it. Even criminal organizations that had no direct connection to Johnny Torrio ended up copying his methods. Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish mobsters, Russian organized crime when it emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, all of them organized themselves along the lines Johnny had pioneered. The specifics varied by ethnicity and location, but the basic principles remained the same. But Johnny's legacy extends beyond just organizational structure. He fundamentally changed how criminals thought about their relationship with law enforcement and politicians. Before Johnny, most criminals saw police as enemies to be fought or avoided. Johnny saw them as business partners to be cultivated. He understood that paying off police officers and politicians wasn't just about avoiding. It was about fundamentally changing the power dynamic. If you had enough cops and politicians on your payroll, you weren't operating outside the law, you were part of the system. The law became a tool you could use against your enemies while protecting yourself. This insight proved remarkably durable. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, successful criminal organizations distinguished themselves by how effectively they corrupted law enforcement and political institutions. Mexican drug cartels, Colombian cocaine kingpins, Russian oligarchs with criminal connections. All of them understood what Johnny had figured out a century earlier. It's cheaper to buy the system than to fight it. There's a darker legacy too, one that's worth acknowledging. Johnny helped create a criminal infrastructure that has caused immeasurable harm. The drug trafficking networks, the money laundering systems, the political corruption, all of it traces back, at least in part, to organizational innovations that Johnny pioneered. He didn't invent vice or violence, but he made criminal enterprises more efficient and more durable than they'd ever been before. Thousands of people have died in gang wars fought between organizations using Johnny's structural model. Millions have suffered from addiction to drugs distributed through networks organized according to his principles. Communities have been devastated by the corruption of political systems that Johnny showed how to exploit. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge, especially after spending thousands of words describing Johnny's intelligence and innovations. But it's true. Johnny Torrio was brilliant, and he used that brilliance to build something fundamentally harmful to society. Yet there's an third dimension to his legacy that's more nuanced. Johnny proved that even in the criminal world, intelligence beats violence. Cooperation beats conflict. Long-term thinking beats short-term greed. These aren't inherently criminal principles, they're just good management. That they were applied to illegal enterprises doesn't change the fact that the principles themselves are sound. In a strange way, Johnny's most important lesson isn't for criminals, it's for anyone pursuing any goal. Think systematically. Build strategically. Cultivate useful relationships. And most importantly, know when you've achieved what you set out to achieve and walk away. This last lesson might be Johnny's most significant contribution, even though it's the one that almost no other gangster learned. Johnny understood that success in crime, like success in any high-risk field, isn't just about reaching the top. It's about getting down from the mountain alive. The graveyard of organized crime is full of men who won every battle except the last one. Johnny was smart enough to declare victory and retire before that final battle arrived. His protege Capone learned this lesson too late. Capone remained in power until the government finally found a way to prosecute him. And he died broken and insane, destroyed by syphilis and the stress of his years as America's most wanted criminal. Johnny, by contrast, lived another 32 years after retiring, dying peacefully in his 70s, with his wealth intact and his freedom preserved. The lesson is clear. In any dangerous game, your exit strategy matters as much as your entry strategy. Johnny had both. What would Johnny Torrio think if he could see organized crime today? In some ways, he'd recognize it immediately. The structure of modern criminal organizations, the hierarchies, the division of different operations, the corruption of law enforcement and politicians would all be familiar to him. He'd understand modern drug cartels, organized cybercrime, international human trafficking networks. The scale and technology would be different, but the underlying principles would be ones he pioneered. But he might also be disappointed by how much violence remains in the criminal world. Johnny believed that violence should be a last resort, used strategically and sparingly. Yet modern criminal organizations, particularly drug cartels, have proven remarkably brutal, sometimes seeming to use violence for its own sake rather than as a business tool. The mass murders, the brutal torture, the public displays of cruelty. Johnny would have seen all of this as strategically stupid. The kind of attention-grabbing behavior that brings down law enforcement heat and threatens the whole enterprise. He might argue that modern criminals have adopted his organizational structure without fully embracing his philosophy. They've learned how to organize, but not why to organize, to eliminate unnecessary violence and chaos, but simply to perpetrate it more efficiently. Or perhaps he'd just see it as the inevitable evolution of the criminal world. Johnny operated during Prohibition, when the product he was selling, alcohol, was something millions of Americans wanted and didn't consider morally wrong. Modern organized crime deals more heavily in drugs that destroy lives, human trafficking that involves slavery and sexual exploitation, and violence that terrorizes entire communities. Maybe Johnny would recognize that his professional approach to organized crime only worked in a context where public opinion was somewhat sympathetic to criminals, and that context no longer exists.
What lessons should we, as a society, take from Johnny Torrio's story? There are several, and they're not all comfortable. First, Prohibition doesn't work. The entire empire Johnny built, the foundation for modern organized crime, emerged directly from the government's decision to outlaw alcohol. When you criminalize something that millions of people want, you create a black market. And black markets, by their nature, are controlled by criminals. This lesson should inform our approach to drug policy, prostitution, gambling, and any other activity where prohibition has proven ineffective at reducing demand. Second, corruption is organized crime's most powerful weapon. Johnny didn't succeed primarily because he was violent or because he had better criminals working for him. He succeeded because he systematically corrupted police, politicians, and judges. As long as criminals can buy their way into the system, law enforcement will struggle to effectively combat organized crime. This means we need robust anti-corruption measures, better oversight of law enforcement, and political systems that can't be bought. Third, intelligence and organization can be applied to any field, including criminal ones. Johnny proves that being smart is amoral, it can be used for good or evil, to build or to destroy. We shouldn't romanticize criminal intelligence or pretend that being clever at crime is somehow less wrong than being stupid at it. But we should recognize that combating organized crime requires equal intelligence and organization on the side of law enforcement. Fourth, personal discipline and strategic thinking can protect you even in dangerous professions. Johnny survived and thrived in a world where most of his colleagues died violent deaths or ended up in prison. He did this not through luck, but through careful planning, strategic thinking, and the discipline to walk away when he'd achieved his goals. While we obviously shouldn't emulate his criminal career, there's something to learn from his approach to risk management and knowing when to quit while ahead. Finally, your legacy is defined not just by what you build, but by what others do with what you built. Johnny created organizational structures that made criminal enterprises more efficient and durable. He probably didn't foresee all the ways these structures would be used or all the harm they would cause. But that's the nature of innovation. Once you create something, you lose control of how it's used. In the end, Johnny Torrio was a remarkable man. He was brilliant, disciplined, strategic, and possessed of insights that revolutionized his field. He was also a criminal who built organizations that have caused immense suffering. Both things are true, and we shouldn't forget either in our rush to acknowledge the other. His story is ultimately a tragedy, not in the classical sense of a great man brought down by a fatal flaw, but in the sense of great talents applied to destructive ends. Johnny could have been a legitimate business titan, a military strategist, an organizational consultant. His skills were transferable to any field requiring complex planning and management. But he chose crime, and the world is both different and worse because of that choice. Yet here we are, nearly a century after Johnny Torrio built his empire and more than 60 years after his death, still telling his story. Still trying to understand how this quiet immigrant from Brooklyn reshaped the American underworld. Still seeing echoes of his innovations in every organized crime story that makes the news. That's legacy. Not necessarily a good legacy, but an undeniable one. Johnny Torrio proved that even the underworld has room for genius, that intelligence and organization can reshape even the most chaotic fields, and that knowing when to walk away might be the most important skill of all. He also proved that being brilliant doesn't make you right, that building something impressive doesn't make it good, and that succeeding by your own standards doesn't mean you've actually succeeded in any way that matters. These are the lessons of Johnny Torrio's life. Whether we learn them is up to us. If you've been captivated by the story of Johnny Torrio, the man who invented modern organized crime, built an empire with his brain instead of his brawn, and walked away while he was still ahead, then make sure to subscribe to this channel. We have more stories from the shadows of history, more tales of the brilliant minds and dangerous men who shaped the underworld. Like this video if you enjoyed it, leave a comment telling us which gangster you'd like us to explore next, and remember, the most interesting stories are often the ones that never made it into the history book. Until next time, stay curious about the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of history.